Oh, let me make sure. So I have this one, yeah, and then Hain also we will go over. All right. Good afternoon. This is Ifan from the Strategic Day Trader, and this is the market wrap for February 28th, 2019. Q's down just shy of 0.25% there, and the SPY 0.2. Okay. Coming into today, we were looking at this hourly sell setup. And the plan was if we take out the high, 279.60, that being resistance, we'll be all out bullish because that'll be failure of the sell setup. And if we break underneath this support here, right, then we have a downtrend. We can look for an entry to be bearish. Okay, so that was the pattern there on the SPY. Q's pretty much the same. So as you can see, this resistance held. So we actually don't get any additional clarity here based on what we got today. Now, I mean, you look at the day here on the Qs and the SPY, and it, as you would expect, is the kind of day that really doesn't give us much information. Okay. As far as just like in the morning tomorrow, you could look at a break of today's low. That's 172.70 to retest back to 171.80 on the Qs. And then on the SPY, it's going to be underneath 278.40 to retest back into 277.60. And so that's like a small range, but I think it's a range that we can work with just for tomorrow morning if we don't get like a gap up or we don't get a gap down that clears. Okay, so that'll be like a really short term kind of range. Now, if we're talking about the longer term, right, still bullish. We haven't broke the daily uptrend on the Qs or the SPY. And then the hourly is kind of in a state of flux, which is what we identified yesterday, which is that I want to wait for this support to get broken. We did trigger a sell setup, but if that sell setup fails, then we'll have a bias. And so even though coming into today, we didn't really have a clear bias, I think that was actually the right place to be. I know we came in a little bit more in the afternoon or like right before the close, and otherwise this was pretty much close to unchanged most of the day. So I don't think there was a lot to read into the way that the market was setting up, and I think today was a little bit of confirmation that, you know, the direction is not ready to pick a direction yet, but at least we have identified if we're going to make a change to this hourly uptrend, right, we're going to need to get underneath yesterday's low. Okay, so that's what we'll be watching for. And then over yesterday's high, all out bullish. Okay, it probably will take some time if we clear. You can see there was some consolidation in here. I think if we get over this, though, that failure of the sell setup should give some follow through higher. All right. So Qs and SPY, we will be neutral. I do think we may get a retest here of the 277.60 underneath this pivot here. We kind of tested it a couple times, 278.40, and on the that was on the SPY, and then on the Qs here, 172.70, but it's not a big range to work with until we get to support. Okay. So, but longer term bullish, short term neutral, maybe at the open, we come in and retest yesterday's low. All right, so that's the plan for tomorrow. All right, let's take a look at some plays. Market was very sideways, which means that anything uptrending, downtrending will really, really stand out. So now when you look at this, you might think, well, isn't the move already over? How do I get in this? And not necessarily that has to be true. There are pullbacks, there are breakdowns, right, that can help give you an entry. So what would be the entry on this QRT EA? There's a couple. I put this one out in the room. Okay, I know some people played the QRT EA. Okay, so this, let's look at the gap first. Professional gap down, right? It's been moving up recently. Clear support. Expectation is we go lower. You see it even cleared this support. So what we get the sell-off, confirmation that people want to sell this in reaction to the gap down, whatever the news was, might have been earnings, but we know that sellers are out in force. You retrace, you start to base, you get a breakout failure underneath the base. Okay, let me just grab a sip of water here. Okay, and then into the new lows, your target. Now, if you can hold this, that is a lot of continuous selling there. Okay, I mean, you see here, it's a 25-cent stop, 25 cents per share. And even to this drop, I think you'd be looking at 3 Rs or so. And that, because that almost dropped $1, right? So 25 cents a share. When it goes $1, that's 4 Rs, right? This eventually went to 17.50 when the entry was 19.50. So 8 Rs if you had a crystal ball and you knew to put your limit order there and cover it, right? I don't have one personally, so it would have to depend on the management. But at least the entry was well identified ahead of time, right, on the QRTEA. So just really, really big bar. And I try to point this out. You know, people bring a lot of different ideas to the room, especially people kind of are new and don't necessarily trade gaps. And so, like, usually on these days, I'm not even going to be looking at this QRTA. It's not even going to be on my radar on any of these days, right? It's only because we had a gap down. And you could say it's also because it reported earnings or because it had news, right? So I want to see the big volume come in because that often leads to the big bar, okay? All right. Now let's just, so that was to the short side. And now look at the HAN. Again, this is a gap, clearing resistance, pro gap, clearing resistance, volume, right? Very much significantly higher than the previous days. That means people are watching it, traders are involved, people have business to do in the HAIN. Okay, so here is the HAIN, and here was the numbers, 1925 by 1905. Okay, so you can see the similarities here between the way that the QRTEA came in and retraced. Now, what happened on this HAIN? Now, I know that this made a nice move already in the morning, and maybe you could have played it long. Sure, you could have played it long, had a nice play, and be done with it, right? But then what does it do? Comes in, starts to consolidate, right? And we can see even on the 15 here, many bars, relatively equal highs and equal lows. Okay, so where do the numbers come from? We're basing this right here, 1923, 1922. Give it a few pennies there, and it triggers right there, right? And what's your target going to be? Into the highs. Okay, we retest the highs right there. That's your target one. Okay, and then it never breaks the uptrend from there. It never makes a lower pivot. You see that? A lower low. So this, you can definitely still be in as it's coming up and making a new high here. Okay, now what is important about both of these gaps is not just in the gap itself or the size of the gap. It's also the location of the gap, right? So there's resistance here to the left, and we're clearing that, right? That's out of the way. There's a sell-off here with a little bit of consolidation. There's some back and forth, which is maybe why in the morning, right, it ran into some resistance there. But for the most part, it's been a continuous move down. And that's what I want to see when I'm gapping up against if it's a long-term trend, gapping up against it, that's what I want to go after if I can't get clear void. Now, if you remember in November, maybe you played it with us, maybe you didn't, we shorted this Hain on this day and held on it to just about, I don't know, 30 minutes until the close, because this was expected to be an all-day trend because it was clearing. The last time that this saw 2350, right, was years and years ago. Almost, I think it was almost a decade. So when it's into that kind of void, those are the ones you want to go after. Now, if it's in this case, which is gapping into relatively recent price action on a gap up, I want to be running back into this continuous sell-off. Look at the QRTEA. So on a short, you can flip it, right? It's the other way. On a gap down, I want to be gapping into a relatively continuous run-up. Now, what would it look like if it wasn't a good gap? Let's say this were gapping down. Say this had run up further and then gap down into this base, right? That's not what you want to see. That's what we understand as support, right? So that's not the kind of gap. But in this case, you're going right through this trend here, right? And in fact, broke the lows. There was no way to tell, I don't think, for me, that this was going to take out the lows. It would just be one that you just would manage if you have a management for a runner. And that's the purpose of the runners, because a lot of times on these days where there are a lot of market participants coming in from all time frames, they might have been looking at the weekly and thinking, okay, well, now my weekly, the long is damaged and I want to be out of it. Maybe they were looking at the monthly and they decided that, okay, yeah, this isn't going to be able to turn back up around, even though maybe this was going to be potentially be a higher low, right? And we're not going to actually get back up here. So it's on days like, or maybe they are completely focused on the fundamentals and they just don't like the numbers. So it's on these days where you have not just your everyday market participant, your everyday market maker. There are people focused on all sorts of time frames, information, whatever basis to come in and do business in this, either liquidate a position or start a new short, whatever, right? So that's what this volume gives us an indication for. Okay? All right, so just wanted to go over a couple long, short. I mean, there was a lot today. You know, whether you got involved in the AAOI, you know, some people did, the HPQ, and you can see the similarities. Again, we're talking about gaps, right? Big gaps and big volume. We know people are watching it, right? So on days like today where the market's very, very muted, these are much easier to identify and to anticipate, right? All right. So going into tomorrow, the bias is really not that different from what it was today, and that's just because this new bar that we got here on the daily doesn't provide us. Here, let me go to the hourly. Okay, this new bar on the daily and this movement on the hourly up and then right back down to the open doesn't give us any new information really, right? Okay, so we will go into tomorrow neutral with some support here, right, at yesterday's low. If we break that, then we can shift to a short-term bearish bias. If we get over yesterday's high, we will be all out bullish. Okay. All right. Hope you had a good day today. If not, we'll be back at it tomorrow to close out the week. All right. So best of luck tomorrow, and I will talk to you then. Have a great evening.